In 1882, a controversial German philosopher published three simple words that sent a permanent shockwave through human history. God is dead. Immediately, the public reacted with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and intense anger. People assumed it was the arrogant battle cry of an edgy atheist celebrating the destruction of religion, but they got it completely backward. It was actually a panicked warning. Friedrich Nietzsche realized that the scientific revolution was rapidly tearing down the foundation of human morality. He predicted that without a shared belief system, the 20th century would fall into radical nihilism and unimaginable bloodshed. So this is not a breakdown of a bitter outcast attacking the church. It is an investigation into a terrifying prophecy that society chose to ignore. You are going to see exactly why the void he predicted is happening right now and the radical mental framework he built to help you pull yourself out of it. To understand why the world misunderstood Friedrich Nietzsche so completely, you have to look at the world he was born into. The year was 1844. He was born in a small village in Prussia into a deeply religious family. His father was a Lutheran pastor. His childhood was not filled with radical ideas or rebellion. It was quiet, traditional, and anchored entirely by faith. But tragedy does not care about tradition. When Friedrich was just a young boy, his father died from a brutal brain illness. Months later, his 2-year-old brother died as well. Suddenly, the safe, predictable world he knew was shattered. Despite this massive trauma, the young boy tried to follow the path laid out for him. He excelled in school. He went on to study theology at the University of Bonn. He was doing exactly what society expected of him. He was outsourcing his life path to the established system. But here is where the crack appeared. He looked around at his professors, his peers, and the deeply religious society of 19th century Germany. He saw people who were incredibly comfortable. They had absolute rules for right and wrong. But as he studied history and philosophy, he realized something terrifying. The ground beneath their feet was crumbling and nobody seemed to notice. Nietzsche decided he could not live a lie. He left theology. He abandoned his faith. He shifted his studies to ancient languages and philology. He became a brilliant professor at a very young age, but life kept punishing him. He contracted debilitating illnesses. He suffered from agonizing migraines, severe stomach issues, and creeping blindness. By age 34, his failing health forced him to retire from the only job he loved. He was physically broken. He was constantly in pain. Therefore, he had nothing left to distract him from the brutal reality of human existence. In his isolation, his mind sharpened into a weapon. He watched the rise of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Science was answering questions that religion used to answer. On the surface, society felt like it was progressing, but Nietzsche saw the invisible consequence. For thousands of years, humanity relied on God to provide meaning, absolute morality, and a reason to endure suffering. If science killed God, it also killed the foundation of Western values. He knew that tearing down old systems is easy. Finding a new purpose to replace them is the most daunting task in human history. He realized that when people lose their religion, they do not suddenly become hyper-rational, free thinkers. They panic. They desperately search for a new herd to join. They look for new, absolute authorities to tell them what is right and wrong. He predicted that humans would replace religion with radical political ideologies. He saw the rise of extreme nationalism and socialism. He warned that the upcoming 20th century would be defined by a catastrophic war of ideologies. He was diagnosing a global meaning crisis before it even happened. Nietzsche tried to warn the world. He wrote books like Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He introduced the concept of the Ubermensch. This was not a biological superhuman. It was a spiritual goal. The Ubermensch is a person who refuses to follow the herd. It is a person who looks into the terrifying void of a meaningless universe and decides to create their own values. But the world did not want to hear it. They called him mad. They completely rejected him. He was outcast by society. He was rejected by the woman he loved. He lived a life of absolute solitude. Then came the day that changed his legacy forever. On a cold day in January 1889, Nietzsche was walking down a busy street in Italy. He saw a man brutally whipping a horse. The philosopher ran toward the animal. He threw his arms around its neck to protect it. He wept openly. And then he collapsed onto the cobblestone. His mind went black. He suffered a total mental breakdown and never recovered his sanity. He spent the last decade of his life completely unresponsive, unaware of who he was or what he had written. This is where the greatest betrayal in intellectual history took place. Nietzsche was defenseless. His care was handed over to his sister, Elizabeth. This was a massive problem. Nietzsche actively despised his sister's beliefs. He hated nationalism. He violently rejected anti-Semitism. He even boycotted her wedding because she married a notorious political extremist. But now Elizabeth had absolute control over his life and, more importantly, his unpublished notebooks. She saw an opportunity to rewrite the world's greatest mind. She literally cut, pasted, and forged his writings. She deleted his criticisms of nationalism. She twisted his idea of the Ubermensch into a biological racial concept. She packaged these forged notes into a book called The Will to Power. Through her manipulation, the philosophy of a man who championed profound personal freedom was perfectly aligned with the rising fascist movement. In the 1930s, Adolf Hitler proudly visited the Nietzsche archive. The Nazi Party adopted the twisted version of his work as the ultimate justification for their master race. Because of one woman's lie, the man who tried to save humanity from totalitarianism was blamed for inspiring the worst dictators in history. He became the philosopher everyone hates. Decades passed. The dust of the Second World War settled. Scholars finally went back to his original, untouched manuscripts. They uncovered the truth. They realized his name had been hijacked, but the damage to his reputation was already done. Yet, as we look at the world today, the truth of his original warning is impossible to ignore. Look at the modern landscape. We are living in the exact existential crisis he predicted over a century ago. Traditional institutions have lost their power. Trust in authority is completely shattered. Just as he warned, we did not become independent thinkers. Instead, people are terrified of the void. They are desperately clinging to new digital herds. They outsource their thinking to political tribes, cancel culture, and algorithmic echo chambers. People want the crowd to hand them a pre-packaged set of morals, so they do not have to do the terrifying work of thinking for themselves. We are surrounded by the exact radical nihilism he diagnosed. People feel empty, anxious, and deeply divided. So how do we survive this? How do we live in a world where the old rules no longer apply and the crowd is actively trying to pull us into madness? Nietzsche did not just leave us with a warning. He left us with a blueprint. He lived one of the most miserable, painful, and heartbreaking lives imaginable. Yet he never became bitter. He never played the victim. Instead, he gave us the concept of Amor Fati, the love of fate. He argued that true mental resilience is not about trying to escape your suffering. It is about actively embracing it. You must look at every tragedy, every betrayal, and every physical pain in your life, and accept it as the exact fuel required to forge your own greatness. He believed you should live your life so authentically and with such immense passion that if you were forced to relive your exact life over and over again for eternity, you would gladly say yes. That is what it means to become the Ubermensch. It means stepping away from the noise of the crowd. It means taking absolute responsibility for your own mind. It means creating your own values when the world refuses to give you any. History proves a brutal law of human nature. Any system that removes your responsibility will eventually own your destiny. The trap is thinking that you can find salvation by blending in with the loudest group. Before you adopt the outrage of the crowd, ask yourself a simple question. Are these actually your values? Or are you just hiding in the herd because you are afraid of the dark? Tell me in the comments, where have you seen this pattern of blind obedience in your own life?